description of the Western Isles of Scotland is the oldest known account of the Hebrides and the islands of the Clyde, two chains of islands off the west coast of Scotland. The author was Donald Monro, a clergyman who used the title of Dean of the Isles, and who lived through the Scottish Reformation. Monro wrote the original manuscript in 1549, although it was not published in any form until 1582 and was not widely available to the public in its original form until 1774. A more complete version, based on a late 17th century manuscript written by Sir Robert Sibbald, was first published as late as 1961. Monroe wrote in Scots, and some of the descriptions are difficult for modern readers to render into English. Although Monroe was criticized for publishing folklore and for omitting detail about the affairs of the churches in his diocese, Monroe's description is a valuable historical account and has reappeared in part or in whole in numerous publications, remaining one of the most widely quoted publications about the Western Islands of Scotland. Monroe also wrote a brief description of the 5 main branches of Clan Donald that existed in his day under the title The Genealogies of the Chief Clans of the Isles, and this work was included when description was first published as a stand-alone volume in 1805. The Sibbald manuscript also contains details about the Council of the Isles that operated from Ellenacomhale in Loch Finlagan on the island of Islay. This is the most detailed extant account of the supreme judiciary body that had existed under the lordship of the Isles until its demise in the late 15th century. Author Donald Monro was born early in the 16th century, the eldest of the 6 sons of Alexander Monro of Culterne and Janet, daughter of Farquhar MacLean of Dochgarroch. His father was a grandson of George Monro, 10th Baron of Fowles. Donald became the vicar of Snizort and Rassay in 1526, and was nominated to the Archdeaconry of the Isles probably in or shortly after 1549. These were troubled times in the Highlands and Islands, with Domnaldub's attempts to resurrect the lordship of the Isles only failing on his death in 1545. Partly as a result, the See of the Isles was one of the poorest in Scotland, and although Monro lists 14 islands as belonging to its bishop, in practice rents were hard to collect. In that year, he visited most of the islands on the west coast of Scotland and wrote his manuscript account of them, together with a brief genealogical account of various branches of Clan Donald. He referred to himself as High Dean of the Isles, and his position was one of considerable influence, although the advancing Reformation added further complication to the political landscape in which he was operating. In 1560 the new Confession of Faith was adopted and 10 dioceses were created anew, with the Isles shared between Ross and Argyll. Monro converted to Protestantism and was admitted to the new ministry for the parish of Culterne, to which he later added the adjacent Lemler and Alness. He is said to have lived at Castle Craig, commuting across the Cromarty Firth to preach on Sundays. At Lammas 1563, he became one of 3 special commissioners under the Bishop of Caithness responsible for creating new kirks. The duties were arduous, but he retained his position for 12 years, despite occasional criticism by the General Assembly. The last record of him is dated 1574, and it is assumed he had died by 1576 when new ministers were appointed for Culterne, Lemler and Alness. He never married, and no extant stone marks his burial at Culterne, his written work being his sole monument. Previous descriptions. In a shortly before AD 83, a traveller called Demetrius of Tarsus related to Plutarch the tale of an expedition to the west coast of Scotland. He stated that it was a gloomy journey amongst uninhabited islands, and that he had visited one which was the retreat of holy men. He mentioned neither the Druids nor the name of the island. In his Natural History, Pliny the Elder states that there are 30 Hebrides, and makes a separate reference to Dumna, which Watson concludes is unequivocally the Outer Hebrides. Writing about 80 years later in 140-150 ad Ptolemy, drawing on the earlier naval expeditions of Agricola, also distinguished between the Hebrides, of which he writes there were only 5, and Dumna. The first written records of native life in the Hebrides begin in the 6th century AD with the founding of the Kingdom of Dalriata. Much of what is known of these times is the product of the monastic sites such as Iona, Lismore, Eigg and Tyre, but north of Dalriata, where the Inner and Outer Hebrides were nominally under Pictish control, the historical record is sparse. The names of the individual islands reflect a complex linguistic history. The majority are Norse-Gaelic, but the roots of some may have a pre-Celtic origin. The earliest comprehensive written list of Hebridean island names was undertaken in the 16th century by Monroe himself, which in some cases also provides the earliest written form of the island name. Publications. Monroe's work was first published in Latin in 1582. It forms 11 short chapters of George Buchanan's Rerum Scoticum Historia, with all of the islands listed, although with much omission of the detailed island descriptions. The genealogy section was included. In 1603 the portion in Scots relating to the islands was published in Certain Matters Concerning the Realme of Scotland, edited by John Monopony, of Pitmill in the parish of Kingsbarns, Fife. Following Buchanan, this version gives many of the island names in Latin. Thus Monroe's Hediri is Monopony's Erica. The section was republished in the 1612 Scots Chronicles, in which the acknowledgement of Monroe's authorship was omitted. The original version of Monroe's text has been lost, but a copy made in 1642 by Sir James Balfour of Denmiln and Kinnaird is still extant. 3 sections relating to Islay and Lismore, Tyre and Col and Harris were omitted, possibly by careless copying. Some 40 years later Sir Robert Sibbald copied out a complete transcript that included sections missing in Balfour, entitled Description of the Occidental i.e. Western Isles of Scotland by Mr. Donald Monro, who travelled through the most of them in anno 1549. It was acquired by the Advocates' Library in Edinburgh in 1733. Walter Macfarlane created a third manuscript in 1749, either from a debased original or directly from Balfour, as it has the same defects. Monroe's work first came to a wider public when the incomplete version of Description was published in 1774 by William Auld of Edinburgh, along with some supplementary writing about the Hebrides. The full title was Description of the Western Isles of Scotland, called Hebrides by Mr. Donald Monro, High Dean of the Isles, who travelled through the most of them in the year 1549. With his genealogies of the chief clans of the Isles, Description and Genealogies were published together by Archibald Constable of Edinburgh in 1805, which was the first time Monroe's work had been published as a stand-alone volume. Miscellanea Scotica, published in Glasgow in 1818, included Description in Volume 2 and the Genealogies in Volume 4. In this version, Description is given the date of 1594 in error. An edition of the 1818 text, limited to 250 copies, was published by Thomas D. Morrison of Glasgow in 1884. The shorter list was republished by Peter Hume Brown in his Scotland Before 1700, from contemporary documents in 1893, and for the first time the text was subject to scrutiny by a professional historian. Walter Macfarlane's text was published by the Scottish Scottish History Society in 1908 as part of his geographical collections. Ennius Mackay of Stirling included description and genealogies in tandem with Martin Martin's 1703 description of the Western Islands of Scotland in a 1934 publication. R.W. Monroe's 1961 republication includes the full text of the Sibbald manuscript, a comparison with the shorter Balfour old versions, the recovered text of Monroe's description of the Council of the Isles at Finlaggan, George Buchanan's preface to description in Rerum Scoticum Historia, and scholarly accompanying material. Some of the discrepancies between the editions are discussed by R.W. Monro. The 1612 version by Monopony certainly loses both accuracy and detail. For example, his publication has the Flannan Isles half a mile towards the west equinoctial from Lewis, whereas the original quoted by the old version has them 50 mile in the Occident seas from the coast. In fact, they are 33 kilometers west of Lewis. Critiques. Buchanan was unstinting in his praise for Monroe, describing him as a pious and diligent man. The latter's reputation was secure until 1824, when the geologist John McCulloch published a lengthy criticism after visiting the islands several times between 1811 and 1821. McCulloch decried the lack of detail Monroe offered on churches and church buildings, going so far as to suggest that he was ignorant of his own diocese, and accusing him of credulity when it came to the recording of folk customs and beliefs. In 1840, the Rev. Alexander Nicholson wrote in the New Statistical Account that nothing can show the credulity of the Dean more than his account of the cockles being formed in an embryo on the top of a hill, in a freshwater spring on Barra. 120 years later, R.W. Monro was more generous, noting that the Dean was generally careful to distinguish between the reporting of folk tales and claims as to the veracity, and pointing out that McCulloch's statement that it is scarcely possible to recognize 1 in 10 of Monroe's island names was unjustified. In 1893, Hume Brown made the first of several modern attempts to identify them and listed 121 out of the 209 on the Monroe list he had access to. Description remains one of the most widely quoted publications about the Western Islands of Scotland. Identity of the islands. Monroe originally wrote in Scots, and some of the descriptions are difficult to render into modern English without a working knowledge of this archaic style. Some islands have genuine descriptions, but from time to time there are lists such as Vicraren, Narest to the Iyle of Belnichna lays the small Iyle of Vicaren. Nagorna hard on the Iyle Vicaren lays there a small island. Namitin Ericherelon Nagaru wa. Unless the modern name is clear from Monroe's spelling, this can lead to difficulties with identification. The Dean's command of Gaelic was weak, and he habitually provides island names phonetically in English rather than using Gaelic spellings. R.W. Monro states that, of the 251 islands listed by Monroe, I have been unable to identify 27, and a further 23 cannot be regarded as certain. Monroe's belief was that Donald Monro knew the Outer Hebrides and Iona well, but that he may have written about the islands of the Argyll coast from second-hand knowledge, as they were in the Diocese of Argyll and not his own Diocese of the Isles. Later authors have made additional identifications, although some quite substantial islands do not appear to be in the lists. The main numbering system is that of R.W. Monro, based on the Sibbald Ms. The names and numbers used by the 1774 Old Version are also provided. The list is presented in geographical sections for ease of use after Haswell Smith. The Latinized names used by Monipony are also listed along with the modern name, where known, along with various notes where the island's identity is in doubt. Firth of Clyde, Kintyre and the Slate Islands, Vickeran and Nagvi Sog are the only two outright unknowns in this section, although there are difficulties with 22 to 24. If R. W. Monroe's identifications are correct, Donald Monro excluded the sizable island of Garbelach, after which the Garvelix group is named. Inch in the Slate Islands is missing, but the modern name, which means simply island, is clearly incomplete. Its older names include Ellen Nankeo Rakaninis Capule, Craignish, Tenish Jura and the Firth of Lorne. R.W. Monro was unable to identify several islands in this group, but Youngson used his local knowledge and research undertaken by Malcolm MacArthur to suggest various small islands offshore from Jura. In a few instances other nearby candidates exist, with the exception of Lismore. Monroe's descriptions in this section are little more than a name recorded in English and Ayrshire, which makes definitive identifications hard to achieve. Youngson writes that his names defeat all attempts to identify with Lorne, and turn out to be near Jura, and that the islands of the Small Isles Bay and to the south of Jura are all easily identified, and turns his attention to Numbers chapters 39 to 44 for a detailed analysis. The strength of Youngson's analysis is that whereas most of these names evaded identification by R. W. Monro, he is able to offer candidates for almost all of them. In his interpretation, the islands round Jura are listed anti-clockwise starting at Ellenmore, compared to Islay, whose islands are listed by Monro clockwise. This would, however, mean that several large islands are not found anywhere in the Monro list, including Ellen Ree Island, McCaskin and Ellen Mhic Cryan off the Argyll coast. There are also numerous other small islands with these names in this vicinity, and it is an odd coincidence that Numbers chapters 39 to 41 all have strong contenders in Loch Craignish, as identified by R. W. Monro. Youngson does not refer to the section below, which is also missing in its entirety from the Old and Monipony publications. Islay Monro states, her begin to circle Iyla, Sungates about A with little I isles. The percentage of islands listed is high and must include several very small islets or skerries. This comprehensive listing contrasts with the omission of various larger islands, including a few that are inhabited in the Outer Hebrides. There are many correspondences between Timothy Pont's map of Islay published by Johann Blau and Buchanan's version of Monroe's list. It is possible Pont knew of Monroe's work and added a few islets on this basis, and the correspondence with modern maps and names is not clear in some instances. Some of the linguistic connections between names are also obscure. For example, the Sibbald MS No. 72's Hesiel is also Ellen Natravi in the Old Version, which names hints at a pronunciation of the Gaelic for beach, yet Monopony has Colerna, and R. W. Monro identifies the island as possibly being Ellen Crawvark. Colonsay and Mull. Here the shorter Old Version has another missing passage. After Frosa, Monopony states that all their isles are subject to Sankt Combs Abbey. Restaffer above. It is a small island, and in Monroe's day it had not achieved its later fame, which did not occur until its late 18th century discovery. The Old Version joins Sibbald here again, and Monipony adds Megal Verides and Little Verides to the list. Small Isles Skye number 117 is an additional but unnamed island in Old 4 mile of sea fra this isle Tweelan northward lies an Isle Callet, Barra and the Uists. John Lorne Campbell states that Monroe apparently had visited Barra, but it is clear that he writes of the smaller islands from hearsay alone. No's 156 to 64 are also known as the Bishop's Isles. Monroe does not treat Benbecula, South Uist and North Uist as separate islands. Under YWSD he states, and in the north side of this there is ein Parokan Callet Buckler, pertaining to the said Clan Donald. At the north end thereof the sea cuts the country again, and the cutting of the sea is called Carinus, and benorth this country is called Kene Nash of YWSD, that is in English, the north head of YWSD. Numerous islands are missing from the lists including Ronnet, Stewley, Bales Hare, Kirky Bost and Calvi. Lewis and Harris and the northwest. Lewis and Harris is the largest of Scotland's islands and the third largest in the British Isles, after Great Britain and Ireland. It incorporates Lewis in the north and Harris in the south, both of which are frequently referred to as individual islands. Although they are joined by a land border, the island does not have a common name in either English or Gaelic and is referred to as Lewis and Harris, Louis with Harris, Harris with Lewis, etc. The first subsection contains another group not listed by the 1774 Old Version. The ordering of the Sibbald MS is in places slightly different from Moneypenny's and the correspondence is not always obvious. The former's numbers chapter 197 and 201 appear to have been omitted completely in the latter. Harris Loch Roch. Some small outer islands are missing including Beresai and Sealasai. Louis' various islands are apparently missing including Seaforth Island, Ellenmore-Helaster and Borary. North Highland coast missing are Isle Ristel, Hander and Alderney Island. Lewis and Harris genealogies. Monroe provides a brief description of the 5 main branches of Clan Donald that existed in his day under the title Heir Followish, the genealogies of the chief clans of the Isles. Clan MacDonald of Sleat, whose chief in Monroe's day was Donald Gormison, a descendant of Hugh of Sleat. Clan Enmore of Duniveg. Clan Ragnald led by John Moidartach. Clan Ian of Arden Morachan. The House of Alexander Carath, described by Monroe as the fairest haired man of any that ever was. Clan Donald are descendants of Somerled, and Monroe claims that in earlier days the house was known as Clan Gothefrid. This Sumel was the son of Gillibride Gileadam, name Vixella, Vic Mearshire, Vic Swiffen, Vic Malgessa, Vic Echim, Vic Gothefrid. Traquome they were called at that time Clan Gothefrid, that is, Clan Gothry in Hiberslide, and they were very great men in the times, sire. The name Gofraid also appears in numerous other versions of Somerled's ancestry. Council of the Isles. Finlagan was the site of the court of the Buashinan Elenin, the chief of Clan Donald. Ellen Narcomhail was originally a timber-framed crannog constructed in the 1st century BC, just offshore from Ellen Moor, which was known as the island of St. Findelugan during the medieval period. The old version of Monroe's text has under number 55 Ela only Ellen for Lagan in the middle of Ela. Ein fair Iyle in fresher water as the concluding sentence, and there is no specific reference to the council. Monopony provides a slightly longer text as a translation from Buchanan about the government of the Isles that operated from Ellen Narcomhail at Finlagan. However, the Sibbald MS has a much longer description, the earliest and most detailed of the 3 main texts that have persisted into the modern era. Monroe describes the membership of the council, comprising 14 of the Isles' best barons, and its role as the Supreme Court of Justice. After the forfeiture of the lordship of the Isles by James IV in 1493, Finlagan's buildings were razed and its coronation stone destroyed to discourage any attempts at restoration of the lordship. The council was briefly revived during Donald.'s 1545 rebellion, just 4 years before Monroe's text was written. The barons listed by Monroe are MacLean of Dewitt, MacLean of Lochbuie, MacLeod of Harris, MacLeod of Lewis, MacKinnon, MacNair, MacNeil of Gia, MacNeil of Barra, MacDonald of Duniveg, MacDonald of Ardnamurchan, Clan Ranald, MacDonald of Lochaber, Bishop of the Isles, Abbot of Iona. The identity of Clan MacNair is unknown.